As a general rule, the Mediterranean theater gets less interest. There were certainly major events that get at least some coverage. Taranto, Matapan, Calabria, and a couple others come to mind. But these are very much exceptions to the rule. Battles in this area often get glossed over with barely a mention. The same goes for the ships. You'll hear about Barham or Roma, but probably not about the many destroyers and cruisers involved in the theater. Of those stories and ships, I'm particularly fond of the story of Espero. In a similar manner to Edsall in the Pacific, this was an old destroyer that embarrassed a much stronger force. In Edsall's case, it was the Kido Butai. For Espero, it was a force of cruisers. It makes for an interesting story worth covering. A story I have covered, at least briefly, before. However, before we get to that, a brief look at the ship before that battle. Brief because there's very little information out there on her career. That story began on April 29th, 1925, when Espero was laid down by the Ansaldo shipyard in Genoa. Her construction progressed at a fairly slow rate, with the destroyer launched on August 31st, 1927, a bit over 2 years after keel laying. The fitting out went faster, with the destroyer commissioned into the Regia Marina on April 30th, 1928. The ship the Italians ended up with was one of the Turbine-class destroyers. These were small ships by later standards, although for the mid-1920s, they weren't that far off the standard. If you compare them to a Fubuki, yeah, these ships come off badly. On the other hand, they're roughly equivalent to contemporary British design in the A class. The same goes for the Mutsuki class in Japan. Now for the specific details. Espero displaced around 1,100 tons at her standard loading. This went up to 1,700 tons at full load. That displacement let the ship carry 2 twin turrets, one on the bow and one on the stern, for a total of 4 120mm or 4.7-inch guns. To support these, Espero was designed to carry 2 40mm anti-aircraft guns and a single 13.2mm machine gun. The real bite of the ship came, however, with the torpedoes. Espero carried 2 triple mounts for a total of 6 21-inch torpedoes. As for speed, that came out to 33 knots on 40,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. Regardless, with that, we finished the design detail. Now back to service history, such as it was. After she entered service in 1928, Espero joined her sister ships in the 1st Squadron of the 1st Destroyer Flotilla, where details fall away, although I imagine it consisted largely of training and patrol duty. Things were so quiet, in fact, that it wouldn't be until 1932 that the ship got any real excitement, and for that matter, a surprisingly long voyage for any Italian warship. Because in January 1932, the Shanghai incident occurred, one of many, many flare-ups between China and Japan in this time period, which doesn't seem particularly relevant to Italy, if not for the fact they had interests in Shanghai, which prompted the Italians to send 2 ships to China. In this case, the cruiser Trento and the destroyer Espero. The 2 ships departed Italy on February 5th, 1932. Trento would arrive in China by March 4th, but Espero had issues with rough weather. The Turbine class as a whole had issues with seaworthiness. This would slow the destroyer down, requiring a detour to Saigon. Espero would only reach China on March 7th as a result. Once the Chinese and Japanese agreed to a truce, the Italian ships left the area. Trento left on May 14th, while Espero would remain in China until 1933, at which point she returned to Italy, where 1934 found the ship as part of the 4th Destroyer Squadron of the 2nd Naval Division, where, near as I can tell, she remained until the start of the Second World War. or shortly before it at any rate. Espero's next service of note is the Mediterranean theater of that conflict. By the time Italy entered the war, on June 10, 1940, Espero had shifted to the 2nd Destroyer Squadron at Taranto. Her service at this point might have continued on quietly. However, Espero would have the misfortune to be the center of the first major engagement in the theater, only 18 days after Italy entered the war, giving her a very short combat career as it turned out. This battle originated from a simple fact. Italy had colonies in North Africa which it needed to supply, both to maintain the holdings, but also to supply pushes into Allied colonies. However, it was dangerous to run supplies south. The British and French fleets were a major concern, and even after France surrendered, the British remained an issue. So the Italians did what the Japanese would do with the Tokyo Express. They loaded up destroyers as fast transports. Espero was one of many used in this way, although she was an early example. The destroyer departed Italy on June 27, 1940, along with 2 of her sister ships, Zefiro and Ostro. The 3 ships carried 2 anti-aircraft batteries, 110 tons of ammunition, and 162 black shirts. Not a major cargo, but still important enough to justify the trip. A trip that did not last very long. Shortly after leaving port, the little convoy was spotted on June 28, 1940. A short Sunderland flying boat sighted the Italians around noon and sent a report off. The 7th Cruiser Squadron happened to be sailing nearby and was immediately routed in that direction. This consisted of 5 light cruisers: HMS Liverpool, HMS Orion, HMS Neptune, HMS Gloucester, and HMAS Sydney. This was, arguably, overkill for 3 old destroyers. Those cruisers outmassed and outgunned the Italians by a fairly significant margin. The British formation sailed for the Italians, spotting the destroyers around 6:30 p.m. Liverpool would be the first to open fire around 6 minutes later. This was at a distance of 22,000 yards, which was rather long range. It gave the startled Italians time to react. Espero, alongside her sister ships, immediately turned away to retreat. This is where things went wrong. Remember, these were old ships by this point. Espero was commissioned in 1928 and had been worked hard since then. The destroyer was about 12 years old at this point, and that age showed. Espero suffered a boiler failure, reducing her speed to 25 knots. Realizing the issue, the destroyer's captain, Enrico Baroni, signaled the other destroyers. They were to make smoke and retreat. Espero would cover them with her own smokescreen and fire on the British to distract them. It was a doomed last stand in the hope the other 2 ships could escape. As such, Espero turned to engage the British. Her 4 guns opened fire, and 3 torpedoes were launched at the cruisers. Those missed, but they were a distraction. It worked in that it slowed down the British. Of course, they did split their squadron. Liverpool and Gloucester took on Espero, while the others moved around, before being ordered to turn back and focus on the madly dodging Italian ship. Through it all, the British were firing so many shells that it was described as a deluge of 6-inch salvos. In spite of this, the Italians would draw metaphorical first blood. A single 4.7-inch shell hit HMS Liverpool, although it did no appreciable damage, aside from splinters, although some of those splinters hit the warheads of 2 torpedoes. It would have been quite embarrassing had those detonated. As it was, though, after over an hour of dodging and firing back, Espero would be hit in her engine room, after the British cruisers closed to around 15,000 yards. That hit brought Espero to a halt and ended her distraction, as the British began to chase her sister ships once more. However, realizing they were low on ammunition, They broke off after only 10 or so minutes. Darkness was falling as well, which would have made that issue worse. While the rest of the British cruisers broke off for Malta, Sydney turned for Espero. The crippled and sinking destroyer managed one more salvo before Sydney finished her off. At 6,000 yards, the cruiser fired 4 salvos. This set fires and explosions that wrecked the destroyer. Reports indicate that Captain Baroni went down with his ship. Ultimately, 47 of the 225 men aboard were rescued by Sydney. The Australians also left behind a cutter filled with food and other supplies for any survivors they missed. However, only 6 more men would be located, 14 days later, by an Italian submarine. There's a quote here that sums up this action well. Morning showed the muzzles of Sydney's guns stripped of paint, which hung in long reddish-gray streamers almost to the deck. The British succeeded in sinking Espero by using up nearly 5,000 rounds of 6-inch ammunition. Coupled with other supply issues, the Mediterranean fleet had only 800 rounds left in stock for its light cruisers. Malta convoys had to be cancelled because of this. This seems insane to think about, but then the Japanese expended over 1,000 shells to sink Edsall. An old destroyer, handled skillfully, could really fluster enemy ships. Espero is a fine example of this. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.